Well, hey everybody, I'm excited to be here. Like Kelsey said, my name is Josh Andrews, and I'm a business attorney. I work with entrepreneurs and small businesses every day. I'm the managing partner of Gatehouse Law. We're a boutique law firm that focuses on providing comprehensive legal representation to business owners that's accessible, predictable, and approachable. Our mission is to lower the barrier of entry to legal by offering an education-first approach to legal advice and services. And that's why we're here. So let's get started. I'm a business lawyer and I know business law. I don't practice business law in between divorces and speeding tickets. This is what I do. I just do business law. I work with startups and help business owners understand how to go from the ideation phase to wherever they're trying to go. Whether that's to grow a multi-generational business that you can pass on to your kids, or for an eventual exit on the sale of your company. And we work to help you protect your business along the way. It makes me especially geared to talk to you about your business. Now, the thing about being a lawyer is everybody expects to be bored out of their mind listening to you talk, right? So you offer free food, hope everybody comes. But my goal is to focus on getting you information that's going to help you understand the legal that impacts your business, but also information that's going to help you as you grow your business. Today is an important piece because as you're in the middle of growing your business, and you're either here or you're hoping to get here, is the idea of bringing someone on to help you, right? So you may be in Forge working with other people, or you may be here as a solo just trying to figure this out, but at some point our goal is to grow, right? And so we have to start looking at the help that we're going to get, right? And so today we're going to talk about the two different types of workers that exist in the law, which is the contractor, right? We've all heard about independent contractors, and employees. And there's a distinction, and it's an important distinction that can cost you money if you get it wrong. And so we're going to talk about how to make sure that we do it in the right way so that we're not just saying one thing even if it actually means something else. Because the distinction between contractor and employee is not is not just that you call it one or the other. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to choose what's right in your business. So to understand how the distinction between the contractor and the employee, the reality is that we need to understand what a contractor is. So employees are not contractors, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about both of those. But to get started, looking at what a contractor is, right? We call them independent contractors, right? They're called different things in different industries. In the construction industry, you have subcontractors. Basically, they're independent workers, right? We give them some kind of control over when and how they work. We let them use their own equipment, and most of the time they're responsible for their own expenses. Now, sometimes we reimburse our contractors, but they're responsible for the expenses ultimately. And the reason for this is that we give them the flexibility, right? And the way that we pay them is structured accordingly. Typically, a good way to kind of see in the small business world, to kind of see whether you've got a contractor or not, is if that worker that you have could actually start their own business doing what they're doing for you. Right? Then all of a sudden we start to see that they're really contractors. And when we get to the end of this, we're going to talk about some of the kind of clear ones, right? Like your lawyer is an independent contractor, right? Your bookkeeper is probably an independent contractor. Your accountant, those types of things. And so we're going to start trying to see what the difference between those types of workers are. I doubled that up. Several years ago, the IRS decided to start cracking down on small businesses' use of independent contractors. This happened sometime between 2008 and 2012. All of a sudden, what the IRS realized was there were a lot of small business owners who were trying to save money by paying people a reasonable hourly rate, but calling them contractors and not paying the employment tax, right? And so we see that this happened. It was toward the beginning of my practice in 2008 when we started to see the IRS come down on this. Well, part of the problem was that they had this 20-factor test, right? It was 20 prongs to determine whether you had an independent contractor or an employee, right? But if you read what was going on, they would even say, well, none of these is more important than the others, and none of them is given extra weight over the others. And so you were just left to go, well, but you don't have to hit all 20 factors. You just have to hit some of them. But we're not going to tell you how many because it varies by circumstance, right? So all of a sudden, lawyers, small business owners, we were trying to make these decisions. Do I have a contractor? Do I not have a contractor? And so they started cracking down because there's sometimes when it's pretty obvious, right? You're paying somebody $12, $13 an hour and saying they're an independent contractor, but they work from 8 to 5. They use the computer you gave them. They're on your health insurance. that's an employee. There's no question about that. But then there's some times where there's some kind of distinctions, especially in the early stages of the business, and that's what you guys may be battling at this point. So the good news is the 20-factor test is now an 11-factor test. Right, that was awesome. And then they actually grouped it into 3 primary categories so that we could start to kind of see. Now, still, these 3 primary categories, we don't actually know which ones are more important than others, despite the fact that some actually have more factors than others. But these are the 3 ways that we actually look at whether or not we have a contractor. It's how they actually behave as a worker, how they're actually paid as a worker, and how we've structured the relationship. So part of the test is actually what we're saying we're doing. But that's not the deciding factor, because there's a lot of people who try to do it. And so we have to understand all of these elements to make sure that it works and it makes sense. So I'm going to, throughout the discussion today, I'm going to use the term worker to talk about a person who works for you, because a lot of what we're talking about is either an independent contractor or an employee, and sometimes we're trying to determine the difference. So we're going to use the term worker as often as possible to make sure it's clear, and then I'll try to be distinct when we talk about the others. So to start, we look at this behavioral control, right? These are the first 2 factors of the test. So it's what you tell them about how, when, where, or with whom to work, right? That's a big factor, right? So if you have somebody who has to be at work from 8 to 5, they have to sit at that desk over there, they have to use that computer with that particular email that you've given them, right? That's an employee. We know that, right? If you have to wear this hat and stand at that cash register and say, would you like fries with that, you're probably an employee, right? If they sit at the desk from 8 to 5 and they answer the phones and you tell them when they can take their lunch and what their vacation time looks like, then they're probably an employee, right? So it's about this control. And then we look at how you train your worker, right? So do you actually bring them in and they have to go through a week of understanding stuff and how you do things, right? And we can say, like, the Ritz-Carlton way, right? Like the way that they do stuff. Do you teach them the 20 behaviors that they pay attention to and make them go through all of that, and memorize all of those things, and act a certain way, and dress a certain way, and tuck their shirt in a certain way, and wear their hat a certain way? Are you telling them exactly how they're supposed to do it and training them in exactly the way that they're supposed to operate something, right? This is how we start to see whether or not we have an employee. Now, this is where it becomes interesting, is because in either one of these, you can actually have instances when you have a contractor, but you've told them when and where to be somewhere. You can have instances when you have a contractor, but you told them how to do something. Because ultimately, as the business owner, you are in control of the quality of what you give. So if it's a service that's being provided, you're going to tell people how you want that service to be provided, right? Because if they're facing the client, you want it done a certain way. And so there are elements where you can treat an independent contractor in ways that they may start to look like an employee. And this is why we don't have these kind of determining factors. That doesn't decide whether or not they're a contractor. So then we move to your financial control, right? We all know, when you hire an employee, you're hiring them, you're offering them some amount of money, salary and hourly pay rate, what's your vacation, what's your time off policy, how long do I have for lunch, whatever those happen to be, those are things we see as employment relationships, right? That employer-employee relationship. When you have somebody who comes in who does their work and then they leave and they go home, right? They're most likely an employee because there's no incentive for them to go beyond that. Right? Are there services available to others? This is a big one, right? Obviously, sometimes we have part-time workers who may work more than one job, but are there services available? Are you working with a person who's also doing exactly what they're doing for you for somebody else? Right? Do they have a business that's doing that? Whether or not they've created an entity because they didn't actually come to these talks or not, but are they actually operating a business to do that? How are you paying them? Right? If your pay structure looks very much like every other employment job that you've ever had, then there's a question as to whether or not you're actually you have an employee, right? So if you offer them, $15 an hour, $20 an hour, something like that, chances are you're treating them like an employee because those are employee numbers, right? Because one of the things about the prices for employees, and as you grow and as you start to see things, when you're calculating an employee, employees get I'm not going to get political in this, but employees get the dollar amount that they get because of the cost that goes into the employer on the other side that the employee doesn't even necessarily see, right? Because there's money that the employer has to pay in taxes just for hiring somebody, right? There's money that goes into certain things, and that's all a part of that calculation. Well, when you take that out, all of a sudden the money that's going to the contractor is higher because they're covering all of those things, right? And so that's an important piece of it. And then a big question is whether the worker can make a profit or a loss on their work. Now, this is slightly different than bonuses or incentives, right? So a bonus or an incentive says if you do this really well, or if the company does really well, you get this extra money, right, on top of whatever you have. That's great. But an employee doesn't necessarily have a loss in what they do. An employee comes to work, you pay them when they're working, right? You don't pay them when they don't work, unless it's part of your vacation policy, in which case you give them money for not working because that's part of the job that you gave them. But they can't have a loss, because if they spend money for the company, you have to give them back the money, right? Right? So they can't necessarily have a loss, but a contractor can be required to have their own computer. A contractor can be required to keep their own phone. A contractor can be required to have their own software that's associated with it. And a contractor could technically spend more money on providing you a service than they make, right? Just like we can. Just like we can be wrong on what we're charging a client and end up losing money on that, right? That's one of the primary differences we start to see in that financial control. And then the last category we have for contractors is that type of relationship. And you see the written agreement, right? So put it in writing. This helps a lot, but it doesn't necessarily control it unless the written agreement defines what the relationship is. So what does the agreement say? Does the agreement call you a contractor? Does the agreement outline when and where you're supposed to work? Does the employee receive benefits? Do they get your health insurance? Do they get something like this? This gets a little squirrely when you get into, say, like the real estate world, right? Where you've actually got a group of what you would look at as independent contractors who are out trying to sell houses. And their payment's structured a certain way, but they get benefits. Right? Because technically they're an employment force, but they're not, because that's the way it's structured. Because that particular industry looks a certain way. And that's one of the things we consider. It's not one of the factors, but it's considered. Number 10 is the permanence of the worker in the business, right? So if you have a bookkeeper, an accountant, somebody like that, they're working for you. You know, they may have worked with you for 20 years, but they may not work, tomorrow, right? Because they're fungible. Because you didn't train them. They do what they do. They give you what you want, and it's either what you want or not what you want, and you use them or you don't use them. And it's their job to remain permanent in your business. And are the workers' services a key aspect of the company's regular business, right? So say you're a law firm and you hire a bunch of lawyers, and you need lawyers to grow your business. You're going to have to come up with some other factors to prove that they're a contractor, right? Because that is what you do. That's an interesting thing when you get into, say, technology, right? You start hiring developers to do a certain thing. So all of a sudden you've got, this is key services to what you do, right? But then you've got this issue of permanence in the business, because are they just being hired for a project? And are they being paid a certain way under that project, right? Are they being billed to the client at a certain rate that they're then making, right? So we start to kind of have to move through all of these different things. This is why when somebody comes and says, I'm going to hire some independent contractors, we always back up and go, okay, what are you actually doing? Because there's a lot that goes into it to make sure that what you actually have is in fact a contractor. So let's talk about who is a contractor, right? We got a couple that are really clear. Your lawyers, your accountants, your designers, if they're not like doing the job of designing, but they're designing on your behalf, right? They're pretty clearly contractors. If you're hiring another business to do a thing, it's pretty clear that that's a contractor, right? Because obviously they're not an employee, because you can't employ another business. And so it becomes very clear. But it gets a little complicated when you start hiring someone to do something in your business, and they're also, say, not an established business. So they're doing something different that's really important to the growth of your business. They don't have an established business because you met them sitting at a table over there over coffee one morning, right? And so you guys start working together and you start paying them. And so then all of a sudden we've got into this place and we've got to deal with, well, what are they? Are they actually a contractor? Because I'm just paying them some money. I didn't register, for payroll tax or anything. So what does it look like? How do I deal with that, right? And so part of that actually goes into that written agreement. How do we define what that is? What are they doing? How are you making money together? How are they being paid? How is it structured? Is it for a service that they're doing? Is it a flat fee? Is it an hourly rate? that we're paying them? What does that particularly look like? And I will pause here in talking about that particular thing. If they're creating intellectual property for you, as we've talked about before, we've got to make sure it's in writing so that you actually own said intellectual property, right? And so if we don't put that independent contractor agreement in writing, then we've got an IP problem. And this also goes, and we'll talk about that in employees too. If you hire an employee to create something for you, you own it because it's a work for hire, because that's the reason you hired them. Contractors are treated differently. And so this is one of the reasons that we want to make sure that we understand what that distinction is. Because if we find out that you have a contractor, right, then we've got to make sure the IP provisions are right. Now, if we find out that you've said you have a contractor, but you actually have an employee, the impact on you can be substantial because the IRS looks backwards. So if the IRS comes and says, that guy's been working for you for 10 years, and I'm looking at the way that they worked for you, and they're your employee. You've had them work for you 40 hours a week, every single week for the last 10 years. In fact, there are several weeks where it looks like they worked 50 and 60 hours a week. And you paid them a certain thing and you gave them benefits, but you know what you didn't give them? You didn't give them time and a half when they worked overtime. You know what you didn't give us? You didn't give us payroll taxes. Right? And so all of a sudden the IRS and the Alabama Department of Labor starts looking for their money backwards. And so all of that money that you thought that you were saving by structuring it a certain way is now owed to the government. And guess what happens? Your business probably doesn't make it through this, right? And so this, again, is one of those places where, from a legal standpoint, we want to make sure that we understand at the beginning how to make it work. So how do you make your worker independent? Well, you let them be independent, one, right? If you hire somebody, you have to trust them to do what they're going to do, especially if you're calling them a contractor. Tell them to bring their own device. Don't tell them when they're supposed to be at the office. Don't necessarily pay them benefits unless you structure it a certain way. Don't pay their taxes for them, but pay them in such a way that they're able to do it. Put your relationship in writing and actually outline what it looks like. Encourage them to go start their own business and sell the service to somebody else. That goes a long way, right? It's not necessarily terrible advice for employees either, but the reality is if you give an employee ownership in their work, you're going to see better results. But it's essential in the contractor relationship because you have to make sure that they are, in fact, independent. Because keep in mind, you can pay a contractor as an employee, and you don't get in trouble for that because you're paying taxes, right? But you can't pay a contractor, an employee as a contractor, and get away with it. So we want to make sure we understand it. So now we need to look at employees and why that's slightly different. Did I say something backwards? Oh, okay. Okay. Making sure. Y'all correct me if it sounds really crazy. But I may have not said it right. So now we look at employees. So what is an employee, right? So how do we understand what that looks like? Well, number one, you have a lot more control over your employees, right? Because you're actually telling them what to do. You're paying for their time. You're paying to control the amount of time that you're paying them for. That's just more or less what it is, right? I will give you X number of dollars. You will be in the office and do these things that I tell you to do, right? So it's important to make sure that this is in writing because we still need to outline what this is, right? We want to look at, so a lot of times, and we're not necessarily going to have time to go too deep into this, but we talk about, employee handbooks versus employee contracts. A lot of people are always afraid of employee contracts because they think it means a thing that it may not necessarily mean. So employee contracts, the biggest thing about an employee contract, especially in the state of Alabama, is that we're an at-will state, which means that your employee can be fired at any time for any reason, as long as it's a legal one. We'll get to that in a minute. But they can be fired at any time for any reason. Well, a contract doesn't change that. And I believe we've talked about this before, but a contract is about term. So if you say, I'm going to hire you as an employee for the next 4 years, you can't terminate outside of the termination provisions of the contract. But if you have a contract that says you're an at-will employee, it's nothing more than defining what the relationship is. This is a place where, especially for employees, that culture becomes really important, right? So we have a culture within our companies. When we start to hire people, we start to develop what that culture looks like, right? We start to feel like a family. A lot of times we use the term team. or squad, as the case may be. But we call it whatever we call it, and so we start to feel we have this own kind of natural culture. And so, a lot of times as business owners, we try to figure out how to control our culture and change our culture and inform our culture and make sure it's what we want it to be. And this is a place where putting that in writing sometimes helps, is to actually write down those things and start to figure out what it is. And so as important as it is to understand what a contractor is, right, we have to understand what an employee is to make sure that a contractor is not that, and then to help inform our decisions as business owners about which one we actually want. Because sometimes you can have employees that you want to treat very independently to get them to get their work done, but you want as a business owner to have employees because of the decisions and the control that you have over certain things. So as much as you may want to give them responsibility and information, you still want to make sure you're protecting your intellectual property with employees. A lot of things you're always concerned about is them taking it, right, and using it against you, which is not necessarily a good thing. But again, that's what the documents are for, right? It's good to protect the mission of your business and to make sure that the employees act within their authority, to define what that authority is. So as I was saying, an employee contract doesn't necessarily change the at-will nature of an employment. You can still, technically terminate someone for any legal reason and what it is. But one of the big differences we get with employees is how we actually deal with problems. So if we have an independent contractor and we have a contractor agreement that says you're supposed to do these things for us, and these are the results we expect, and this is how we're going to pay you. And if you don't do those things, we're going to terminate the contract with whatever notice provisions or however we've defined what that is. Well, employees are a little bit different because we've got a lot more law that's associated with how we're supposed to treat employees and how we're supposed to deal with employees, and one of those is in discipline. And part of this is to protect yourself as a business owner, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And part of it is because you've kind of taken a little bit more control and you've got a little bit slightly different relationship with your employee, and you have these different expectations. So you want to make sure that you conveyed what it is you're looking for and then corrected them. So we call this progressive discipline, right? A lot of times it's, we talk to you verbally, we write a memo to the file, we send you a letter, we actually fire you, right? Kind of thing. Now,
The discipline thing, working in the creative world, that is not a positive thing for an employee, or even, definitely for an employee. The discipline area of owning your own business and having an employee, trying to get that person to be creative and do things. Yes, if you're punching widgets out, yes. But in the creative world, that discipline becomes a big negative, and it's hard to get that creative thing going when you're having to discipline somebody, an employee.
Well, employee discipline, I think, is it's a delicate thing, and I think it's it absolutely has to be built into your culture as to how you make it. Because as employers, we want to make sure that our employees are in a place where they can make mistakes, right? We built a business in a certain way, we do certain things, we have certain expectations. And in the creative world, I would argue I'm very much in the creative world as well. In the creative world, we're dealing with people making decisions and thinking outside of the box. And sometimes, as an employer, it may not be what we wanted. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they did something incorrect. And so I think if we bake into our culture the things that we expect and the things that we want, and then we deal with discipline, and using the word discipline is such a scary thing, right? And so maybe in our culture we don't use it as that, right? Because we have to babysit our creatives. I have a degree in theater, so I can make fun of creatives, but so you have to make sure, right? Because you have to protect them, because they need to feel like they can make these bold choices, right? And if the choice is wrong, we have to have a way that maybe not Simon Cowlish to correct them and tell them that it's something that needs to be dealt with a certain way. And so it is important, but it's also it's different between employee and contractor. And so a contractor, you could just say, you're gone, you're done, I don't like it that way, I want it a different way, I'll go find somebody else. An employee, those are the people you're investing in, right? It's a completely different thing. A contractor, as a business owner, we're paying for a service. We expect a certain result. And if we don't get that result, we move them on. An employee is someone you're taking under your wing, you're investing in, you're trying to grow them into what you believe they can be, right? It's something that is completely different. And so in this discipline, the best thing you can do is help them see that, because you see potential in them, and help them understand what that is. And that is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult parts of being a manager, especially with my personality. But that's a thing that you really have to deal with. But the discipline becomes important because this is where we have to stroke the balance between culture and making sure our people understand it and the things that your lawyers need to see in case you actually do have to let that person go, which means the file has to be documented. And so we have to figure out how to strike that balance and be creative about what that is, but we still have to make sure and walk through the process because you can't just get mad one day and fire them because then we have no way to prove that you were right or wrong, and those are the worst cases that we have to deal with. So, we want to make sure we outline that process. We want to think through that. And as small business owners who think outside the box, we want to make sure that our culture kind of outlines that. So we're not necessarily just pulling this template off the internet going, this is how everybody else does it, because that may not be how you do it, right? That may not be how you want to act. That may not be what you want to be. And so let's back up and think about what that relationship is. But that's the reason we put it in writing. It's about expectations. And so we talk to our creatives and we say, look, you're good at this. I believe that you can do it, but this isn't how we do it. Right? So we can fire someone for any legal reason, right? If we have an employee, it's a legal reason. And we live in the state of Alabama, so we have to be really careful. So legal reasons are, job performance, things that they were expected to do, insubordination, acting a certain way. Non-legal reasons are because you don't like something about the color of their skin, their race, their religion, their sex, their national origin, their age, the fact that they told on you because you were doing something you weren't supposed to, or the fact that they filed a workers' comp claim because they got hurt while working for you, right? We can't fire people for that. Lawyers are good at a lot of things, but we can't fix that. So the problem with having these particular type of exclusions is we have to prove it, right? So if you fire somebody and say they happen to be older and you fired them for a specific reason and there was a legitimate reason, what's going to happen? They're going to find a lawyer who's going to come after you and say that you fired them because they were old, right? And so the reason that we go through the progressive discipline is so that we can prove, no, it's not because they're old, it's because they showed up to work at noon every day. It's because they did never do their work. It's because they drank whiskey at lunch, at their desk, in front of the client, Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but sometimes. But so we want to make sure that we've documented that file as an owner, right? And make sure that it's there so that we can protect ourselves from these unemployment claims and other things that we may be dealing with. Whoa, goodness gracious. I pressed the wrong button. Oh, no. So now we've got to figure out how to make this decision, right? So a lot of times small business owners come to me, they're like, I'm growing, I need to hire an independent contractor, right? That's the step one, independent contractor. I'm going to pay them $12 an hour. I want them to be here from 8 to noon, and they're going to do these things. They're going to answer my phone. They're going to do all of this stuff. That's an independent contractor, right? No, it's not. A rose by any other name. But they're not an independent contractor if they're not independent. If you have that's a part-time worker, and you have to pay for it, right? And those are things to consider. And there's a lot of things as a business owner when that happens, maybe you can't afford $12 an hour because there's all these other costs that are associated, but you need an employee, right? So we start by, what do I actually need? What am I looking for, right? So if we run a physical space and we need people there, during our time that they're there, and we're actually requiring them to be there at the times that we're open so that we can go grow our business, well, most likely that's going to be an employee, right? Because they're being paid a certain way, they're being told what they're supposed to do, they're using all of the tools and equipment that you've provided in your space. That's an employee. We can't necessarily call them a contractor, right? Now, if we need a contractor, if we need a lot of people who are necessarily doing that, who are providing a particular service, but one of the things that we need is to make sure there's somebody always at the front desk, well, maybe we can back up a little bit and say, okay, well, this is what we specifically need. We need somebody to teach classes in a certain way so that we can fill our agenda, so that we can make sure it works the way it's supposed to. Those are contractors. We're going to pay them so much per class. We're going to give them bonuses if their class is full so they can make extra money. They have to prepare on their own time. They just have to show up for class, and that's it. But we will allow you for some extra money to sign up for time to sit at the front desk, and we'll pay you X rate. They're still a contractor because you haven't told them when they have to be there. They volunteered for it, and you're paying for their time, right? So we've solved two problems at the same time, right? So as a small business owner, what we're looking for is how do we solve this problem that we have? So you have two problems, right? You know you need contractors to teach your class, and you know you need somebody to sit at your front desk. And maybe you can get them both to do that. However, if you're just going to hire somebody who's literally there to sit at your desk, you just hired an employee, and you need to make sure and pay them accordingly. And then we've got to make sure that we structure how it looks. So I'll cover 1 and 2 together. But how does it look, right? How do we make sure that that looks? The point at which you say, this much an hour, and you must be here during these hours, and you can't work any extra hours unless you have approval, and all of those things, you hired an employee. So the second that you've told them what to do and controlled all of that, then it is what it is, right? And we've got to make sure that we've considered those things. The cost is the cost, right? So contractors and employees, contractors in some cases, they feel less expensive to business owners. I'm sure there's blogs that are out there, no employment tax, right? That's great. But the reality is, as a good contractor, somebody who actually does it and pays attention, you're paying for that. Right? Their cost should be associated with it. So the difference in hiring a bookkeeper who's going to work in your office, 6 to 8 hours a week, who's going to be paid, $12 an hour, $15 an hour, something like that, and a bookkeeper who's going to maintain your books every single month for however many hours they take, the price difference between the two is substantial. Right? Now the difference is, one's an employee, you have complete control, you can tell them how to do it, you can tell them exactly what you want to do, you can tell them when they're supposed to be there and, make them change certain things. The contractor's going to do what they're going to do, and they're either going to get good at it or, delegate it down or do whatever they want to. And you got to make sure that you look at that. But the cost is going to be different. It's not the difference in I need somebody to work 10 hours, and I'm either going to pay them $12 and no employment tax or $12 an hour and employment tax. That's not the decision that we're making, though a lot of people make us feel like that's the decision that we're making. So now what, right? You're in a place in your business and you need to grow it and you need to get people in there because that's how we move forward, right? We get people to do these jobs that need to be done so that we can grow. The key is, as in so many other things that we talk about here and legal decisions that are being made, is that you have to understand the decision that you're being faced with, right? It's not as simple as this is what I want, right? We have to understand both options so that we can make that decision, so that we can make the right decision for our business. So I'm going to hang around. I'm sure this is one I was telling them before we started that I get questions about this every time I'm here. So my goal is to make sure we got plenty of time for questions, and I want to make sure that you guys leave having something that's actionable in your business, a decision that you can make, so that you can have it. So I'm gonna hang around as long as they let me to answer your questions. But I would also love to tell you guys a little bit about us. Like I said, we provide comprehensive legal representation that's accessible, predictable, and approachable. We have no surprise billing. That's one of our core tenets. We like to make sure that you know before we get started what it's going to cost. We want to take care of you. That's the predictable part, right? We're here. We want to answer your questions. We want you to understand what's going on. That's the accessible part. And I'm not wearing a tie. I'm hoping to be more approachable. Also, it's 1,000,000 degrees outside. But I gave up my tie a few years ago. Anyway, so I'd love to answer your questions. I'd love to connect with you guys to talk more as we move forward. But at this point, does anybody have any? We'll start with employee independent contractor questions. Yes, sir.
Through your explanation, you did answer the question for me because I run a retail clothing store, so it's hard to get an independent contractor to work in a clothing store. But if the guy sells his own CDs and then I just need somebody in the front room, we can work that time out that way.
So he's actually basically working in your space, doing something, and then sometimes also helping.
Right.
There may be ways to make that work, and that's one of those where the relation and how you structure it and making sure it's in writing. You've got to make sure that he's compensated for it, but if he's supposed to be in the store and he's getting the